If you like our video, click the button to subscribe to our channel and get easy access to new content. To see our full suite of ad-free video courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides, visit us at www.teachucomp.com. You can warp text in Photoshop to apply a general shape to the text. For example, you can apply the arc warp preset shape to text to make the text arc like a rainbow. You cannot warp text that has faux bold formatting applied from the character panel, nor can you warp bitmap fonts, nor any font that doesn't include outline data. As shown in the previous lessons titled How to Create Point Text Using the Type Tools in Photoshop and How to Create Paragraph Text Using the Type Tools in Photoshop, you can warp text in Photoshop by applying a warp preset to the text when creating the text in the text editing mode when using any of the selected type tools in Photoshop. You can also apply a warp preset to warp text in the text editing mode that appears if editing type layer text created using the horizontal type tool or vertical type tool in Photoshop, as shown in the lesson titled How to Edit Text in Photoshop. Alternatively, you can warp text in Photoshop within either a selected type layer or within a selection in a normal raster layer that contains editable pixels after you apply a filler stroke using the type mask tools. Technically, you can warp any visible pixels selected in a raster layer or layer mask. However, note that applying a warp moves the pixel content, which may produce an unwanted lack of pixel data in the location those pixels previously occupied in the raster layer, depending on the surrounding pixel content in the layer. To warp text in a type layer in Photoshop, first select the type layer to warp in the Layers panel. Alternatively, to warp raster text created after stroking or filling a type mask selection instead, ensure the text selection appears on screen and has visible pixels to warp within a selected raster layer in the Layers panel. However, note you can select any pixels to warp in a selected raster layer or layer mask if desired. To apply a warp to the selected content, select Edit, Transform, Warp from the menu bar. A blue transform box then appears around the selected content. If transforming a raster selection, you will also often see a blue warp grid overlay appear within the transform box. These warp grid lines also appear after you select a warp preset to apply to vector content too. The options for applying the warp transform, which vary for vector versus raster content, appear in the options bar control panel. To apply a preset warp transform for either type of transformed content, select a warp preset from the Warp dropdown in the options bar control panel. The settings for the selected type of warp preset then appear in the options bar control panel. To change the bend percentage of the selected warp preset, enter a percentage value between -100 and 100 into the Set Bend field in the options bar control panel. To change the warp preset's horizontal distortion percentage, enter a percentage value between -100 and 100 into the Set Horizontal Distortion field in the options bar control panel. To change the warp preset's vertical distortion percentage, enter a percentage value between -100 and 100 into the Set Vertical Distortion field in the options bar control panel. To change the warp preset's orientation, Click the Change the Warp Orientation button to toggle the orientation each time you click it. To change the appearance of the warp guides, click the Set Warp Guide Line Display Options button in the Options bar control panel to show a drop-down menu. To set the warp guide line's color, opacity, or density, click the Color, Opacity, or Density drop-downs in this drop-down menu respectively, and select a desired choice using the drop-down or sliders that appear. To set when warp guides appear, select the desired option button for when to show warp guides at the bottom of the drop-down menu. Note that these warp guide display options do not change or reset between warp applications in Photoshop. To reset the warp preset to its default preset, either select the default preset from the warp dropdown or click the Reset the Warp button towards the right end of the Options bar control panel. Doing this will not change any warp values you entered. If needed, to switch the options shown in the Options bar control panel between the Warp mode and the Free Transform mode, click the Switch between Free Transform and Warp modes button in the Options bar control panel. You can click this same button when viewing the Free Transform options to view the Warp mode options again if needed. To apply a warp transform in Photoshop after changing its settings, click the Commit Transform button in the Options bar control panel. To cancel the transform instead, click the Cancel Transform button. For raster warp transforms only in Photoshop, you can apply custom warps if desired. To edit the shape using the default grid, select the default choice from the grid dropdown in the Options bar control panel. Then click and drag to move the default anchor points and direction points for each anchor point, which are the small blue dots that appear. Unfortunately, if using the default warp grid appearance, you can't see the difference between the anchor points and direction points in the warp shape, as they all look like blue dots. Alternatively, to apply a grid to the warp transform shape that lets you see warp anchor points as white circles or white squares, and direction points as blue circles, select a grid choice from the grid dropdown other than default. If you select Custom, then enter the number of columns and rows into which to divide the shape in the Columns and Rows fields in the Custom Grid Size dialog box that opens, and then click the OK button. After applying a grid layout, then click the white circles or white squares to select the shape anchor points for that part of the shape. When an anchor point is selected, you then see adjacent blue circles for the anchor point appear. The blue circles are the direction points for the selected anchor point. To move the anchor point to a new location, click and drag it and then release it in the desired location. To instead adjust the angle of the direction points for the selected anchor point, which changes the contour of the shape leading to that anchor point, click and drag the selected anchor point's desired direction point to set the angle for that side of the anchor point. Then adjust its other direction points if needed. You can repeat this process to adjust the anchor points and direction points in the shape as needed. To apply an additional horizontal or vertical warp grid line, only a vertical grid line or only a horizontal grid line to the grid, click either the Split the Warp Crosswise, Split the Warp Vertically, or Split the Warp Horizontally button in the Split section of the Options bar control panel. Then hold your mouse pointer over the desired location in the grid at which to add the grid line or lines, and then click to add them to the selected location. You can then edit the new split line anchor points and direction points as needed, as when applying a preset warp. To then apply the custom warp transform in Photoshop after changing its settings, click the Commit Transform button in the Options bar control panel. To cancel the transform instead, click the Cancel Transform button. Remember to click the subscribe button to see more of our videos. See our full suite of courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides at www.teachucomp.com.